with the Clippers signing John Wall and now having a payroll of over $190 million, how do you think it's going to impact the Clippers going into next year?
Well, it's a matter of health. You have a lot of players on this roster that have been injury prone. Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, John Wall. Come on, man. I mean, Marcus Morris was missing some time last year. Like, we're talking about more than 30 to 40% of this roster being injury prone. Kawhi Leonard and Paul George are set to make $84 million between the two of them. Kyle just said that the cap space, like the cap total, is about 123. That's more than half the cap between two people. You go and you sign John Wall. John Wall has not played meaningful basketball. I mean, a couple of years. You go and you get him, and I saw an interview where John had made an interesting point. You have Kawhi and Paul George on the same team. Arguably, you can kind of pick which one is going to be your number one scorer depending on the night. We all know it's Kawhi, but Paul has shown that he could carry the load. John Wall made the point. The third best player on the court has to guard him. If John Wall is 75% of what he was 3 years ago, good luck guarding him. He's literally, I want to say, a year and a half away from playing basketball. He's rested. His body is healthy. No rehab, no issues off the court. You saw in warmups while he was in Houston. You saw at practice while he was in Houston. He still had it. He just chose not to play, and then Houston and John Wall had agreed, with the contract, it's just best suited that he not suit up. For whatever reason, that was just the decision they came to because nobody wanted to take on his $47 million contract. Dude, John Wall running the floor, running the floor with Marcus Morris when healthy, with Luke Kennard as a sharpshooter, with Norman Powell on the break, with Kawhi Leonard, and freaking Paul George, and Zubac, which is a big that can run, Batum coming off the bench. Like, this is a very, very solid team. Covington in the corner. This is going to be an interesting roster. I think the Clippers can make some noise and go into a top three, potentially top two seeding if everybody stays healthy. Kawhi's been away for a long time. Paul George has an offseason to fully recover from whatever it is he's had. And of course, now John Wall has an opportunity to prove the world that I still got it. This team's going to be scary. I think that the cap is absolutely ridiculous because when you break it down, like literally, like I said, two players take up well over 50% of your cap space. I will never agree to any of that. But when you look at this on paper, this is a good roster. But Kyle and I made the point before we started recording. When you look at a roster on paper, doesn't necessarily equivalent to what it's going to actually be on the court. We'll see what happens. But this Clippers roster, as it's currently assembled with the cap, they are all in. And if they don't win, this is going to be a very, very expensive loss.
Yeah, it's just, I'm looking at the contracts and just like the cap hits of really all the main players. I mean, Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, they account for 42%. So you were close. It was like you were really out by like 8 percentage points. 42% of the cap with two players. It's absolutely nuts. And then when you look at the rest of the roster, Norman Powell, he's making 16 mil going into next year. I believe Marcus Morris is making around 16. And then, you add in John Wall, Nicholas Batum, Reggie Jackson. I mean, they have a pretty decent roster to work with here going into next year. Obviously, the cap hit part is just absolutely nuts with them being $75 million in the hole with a luxury tax. But it tells me the Clippers, this is their team, and they're going all in with it. Whether they win or lose in the end, this is what they're going to be. So overall, I think I'm kind of in a similar sentiment with Kevin about the Clippers being potentially a top three team in the Western Conference. I'm not going to say they're going to go as far as a 2 seed. Now, granted, he did make the point about them staying healthy. Obviously, that has to be the factor here if they're going to make a top 3 seed in the Western Conference. The Western Conference is an extremely stacked conference and has been for quite some time. It's just that when I look at this roster, I just don't see longevity here. I don't see sustainability as far as being healthy the entire way through. Look, Paul George was dealing with a litany of injuries last year. Kawhi missed the entire year last year with a torn ACL. I would assume that he's fully recovered from that at this point. And then, like Kevin said, John Wall has been dealing with injuries and has been battered with injuries for the last 3 years or so. It just seems like whenever he's ready to hit the court, just something pops up and he misses a significant period of time. Now, hopefully, going into this year, that's not the case. Hopefully, John Wall is 100% ready to go and he does wonders for the Clippers. And, you know, I mean, when I look at the Clippers here, I mean, I'm looking at a roster here that's 9 to 10 players deep. When you got a team led by Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and then you have some pretty solid role players like Norman Powell, Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, Reggie Jackson, John Wall now into the fold, Nicholas Batum. This is not a scrub roster. This is a roster that can compete with the best in the Western Conference. It's just whether or not these guys stay healthy. And when I look at Paul George, when I look at Kawhi Leonard, and when I look at John Wall, these are obviously the three stalwarts that are going to be the focal pieces for the Clippers next year. They're all injury prone. In one way or another, these guys have been dealing with injuries, and it's really hindered them the last year or two. And it could be the same thing going into next year, just because all these guys are getting older. These guys are not, I wouldn't necessarily call these guys like spring chickens anymore. These guys are getting a little bit older. And as time goes on, it just seems to me that the injuries are starting to wither them down a little bit. Is that going to happen next year? Nobody knows right now. I just can't bank on them being healthy the entire way through. So that's where a lot of these role players like Marcus Morris, Norman Powell, Robert Covington, Reggie Jackson, they're going to have to step up in a huge and pivotal way if either John Wall goes down with injury, God forbid, or Kawhi Leonard or Paul George. Obviously, you don't want to see these guys get hurt. You want to see these guys perform at the highest level possible. But if they do, just based on the NBA gods, these role players that I just mentioned, they're going to have to step up in a huge way to carry the Clippers to the playoffs this year, or this upcoming season, excuse me. This team barely missed the playoffs last year. They got into the play-in tournament as a 9 seed, which I actually think is kind of a testament to Paul George for being able to basically drag this roster to that play-in tournament last year, despite all the injuries that this team had. And unfortunately, Paul George wasn't able to play in that play-in tournament game, and he was dealing with injuries of his own. And the Clippers were on the outside looking in when it came into the playoffs last year. I don't think that will be the case this year. I do believe that as long as everybody stays healthy primarily throughout most of the regular season, I think they'll be not only a playoff team, I think they got a real shot to be a contender this year. I'm not saying that they're going straight to the finals and they're going to win the NBA championship. I'm not saying that. But overall, this team is in a better position to succeed than they were last year. And if all those main three guys with Paul, Kawhi, and John Wall, they play a significant amount of games and they play up to snuff, they could really compete for a 3 seed, the way that I see it.